And so that brings us back to George Clinton. That brings us back to Parliament and to Funkadelic. In about 1974, 75, George Clinton is working with both projects equally. But there's an interesting move that he makes with Parliament in about 74 into 75, and it's this song, Chocolate City. So in it, he does that whole signifying thing that I had mentioned earlier, where you take an idea and you kind of flip it on its head in a lot of ways. What is he signifying about? Well, he's signifying about politics, and politics in a way that doesn't necessarily want to do that respectability thing from the civil rights era. So he starts it up. What's up, CC? Well, what does CC stand for? Chocolate City. What is Chocolate City? Washington, D.C. A place that is, has I believe, a majority African-American population throughout most of the city itself, right? But yet, African-Americans not having that same sort of political power within the city. I mean, maybe some of you who understand American politics know that Washington, D.C. itself does not have the same voting rights necessarily as the rest of the United States. It is kind separated and kept apart. And ironically, it has a lot of political problems, a lot of issues, because it isn't supported in the same way as, almost any other city in the United States. And so George Clinton is thinking about Washington, D.C. and what it means, what it represents, the seat of power for the whole country. And even though the city itself is predominantly African-American, it's not necessarily run or, the power structure isn't based upon Blackness. And so Chocolate City takes that idea and flips it on its head. And he starts to kind of rap, if you will. It's not really rap. It's more of kind of like a monologue. Talking about, well, hey, this is what's going to happen, Chocolate City. I love you, and we're going to take this whole thing over, right? And he starts to run down, who's going to be the Minister of Education? Richard Pryor. First Lady, Aretha Franklin. Minister of the Arts, Stevie Wonder. So imagining, a whole government dominated by these major figures in African-American entertainment up until that point. In a sense, he's making an argument about, well, can we have a Black president? This is in 1975, mind you, right? And it's not until 33 years later that it actually becomes a reality. I hate to put it this way, but in 1975, this was a speculative work, just saying, is this even possible? Now, in addition to the lyrical themes, here's where we start to hear a sonic change as well. So two people in particular who are vital to both Parliament and Funkadelic were Bernie Worrell, keyboard player, synthesizer, piano, whatnot, and Bootsy Collins, bass player. And when you listen to it, you hear these synthesizer timbres. This was not something that was common within soul music, and it was certainly not even around during R&B. It's this unusual sound kind of hovering in the air. And the bass, it's almost kind of got this watery kind of whoop, 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 kind of quality to it. And what would be called like an auto filter, an auto wah, or something like that, but on the bass. An instrument that's typically ignored, that usually is so low in the frequency range that people weren't hearing it. And maybe, this is kind of an interesting idea, we can interpret that, if we want to, as a way in which that even flips the roles around within a band. The instrument that's often marginalized and that's kind of tucked back behind, now all of a sudden has prominence. Just like we have a whole community of people that is marginalized, that's put back, whose needs are the last often who are addressed. Well, you bring them right up to the front, right? And that's what gives it its character. That's what gives it its flavor. And so listen to this song, hear how this is a different approach compared to Maggot Brain. Maggot Brain is all about that spaciness, definitely within the realm of speculation. Here we have a difference in sound, much more kind of a direct kind of political message in some ways. Well, all of this comes together when we get to the Mothership Connection, Parliament's concept album from 1975 that followed up Chocolate City. And so this quote from George Clinton kind of really nails down what they were doing. We put Black people in situations nobody ever thought they'd be in, like the White House. I figured another place you wouldn't think Black people would be in was outer space. I was a big fan of Star Trek, and so we did a thing with a pimp sitting in a spaceship shaped like a Cadillac. And we did all these James Brown type grooves, but with street talk and ghetto slang. Well, again, we can think about this relative to my discussion of funk music, right? These repetitive funky grooves where it just kind of hangs out in a certain space and repeats it over and over and over again. And on top of it, rather than having James Brown singing, right, you have somebody who's very much talking in the dialect of the street, of, you know, of their audience. And very much a dialect that was largely ignored by the music industry. And so it's a completely different sound in a lot of ways. And I think it's also too important to note that he brings up Star Trek. Star Trek is really notable, really important to mention, because it, as science fiction, here we have one of the very first representations of African Americans within science fiction on television, Lieutenant Uhura. And my understanding is the actress that played Lieutenant Uhura was really uncomfortable with the idea. Like, you know, Black people don't do science fiction, and this is weird. I don't get it. And my understanding is that Martin Luther King called her up and said, you have to do this. It's vital that we have this kind of representation within this art form. So Mothership Connection is taking all of these ideas, right? Speculation with science fiction, Star Trek, whatnot, but then also very much the language, the look, the feel of 1970s era Black culture, right? Ghetto culture, if you want, and putting all of these things together, and that's what we get with the Mothership Connection. And the song itself, you know, it's so interesting because it's this kind of play with, it's George Clinton kind of talking again, rapping over the whole thing. Star Child here, you know, time to bring back something your memory banks don't remember. And he's talking about the mothership, this tool, this vehicle that is coming down to deliver salvation to everybody. And then, you know, everything, it's such an interesting tune because Mothership Connection really only has 2 sections. And the live version is very different than the recorded version. The recorded version goes back and forth between those 2 sections. The live version just gives you the first part, the A section, and then the B part, and that's it. The live version is incredibly stretched out as well. It gets upwards of, I think, like 12, 13 minutes, where the original version was only 4 minutes. And how do you get to that place? Well, they're just hanging out in that groove that whole time for that whole front A section, right? If you hear any noise, it's just me and the boys. You know, this is a party song. And the version I'm going to give you is the live version. And when you look on stage, there's just tons of people, an enormous amount of people on stage. That was typical for P-Funk. Still is. There can be up to 20 people on the stage at a P-Funk show. And sometimes George Clinton is on stage, and sometimes he's not. In some ways, like, he's the ringleader for everything that's happening, but he's not kind of like, you know, your typical lead singer determined to have all the attention all the time. It kind of moves around, right? So that gets us to the other part of Mothership Connection, this swing down, sweet chariot, stop and let me ride. This is a really kind of important aspect of the song to deconstruct, because here is that Afrofuturist gesture towards taking the past, reinterpreting the past into a futuristic context, while at the same time critiquing the present moment. Always remember this idea. Taking the past, reimagining the past into a futuristic content to critique the present. Well, what's happening here? That line itself is a reference to the old spiritual, the Wallace Willis tune, "Swing Low, Sweet Chariot," coming forward to carry me home. Well, maybe you do know that this song, this old hymn that people still sing in some churches, this was itself a secret message in the Civil War era. That what they were singing about, swing low, sweet chariot, coming forward to carry me home, yeah, it might be, a lot of people reinterpret it as kind of like, being, delivered to heaven. But it was also a message about the Underground Railroad. It was referencing the fact that there were people trying to help liberate people from slavery and take them to a better life. So that was Swing Low, Sweet Chariot. Now we think about it relative to the future. We think about it relative to the mothership, right? This kind of, space Cadillac, if you will. And what does this mothership do? It is there to deliver African Americans, to deliver people from their oppressive conditions from the 1970s. That this would be the vehicle of their salvation. In the show, you see at the very end, Glenn Goyne starts singing about, I think I hear the mothership coming. And sure enough, they would fly this enormous mothership over the crowd that would land on the stage. 1975, that was just wild. That was insane. Nobody was doing something, as over the top with their stage shows, except for people like David Bowie and whatnot. Most rock shows, they wouldn't even touch something like that. So this was just this wild idea. And it was very much about, this music is here to provide your salvation. The band, this song, this groove, these are the means to help you liberate yourself. And so this is all very much, I would say, a purposeful connection being made here by George Clinton, bringing the elements of that spiritual with these notions of the future, with these notions of salvation, all of it coming together. Then in about 92, 93, I think it is, Dr. Dre would actually use that line, that swing down, sweet chariot, stop and let me ride. I bring this up because you might hear it and say, oh yeah, I do know that song, which is crazy considering that Let Me Ride is like a 30-year-old tune, but that's just me being an old man. Anyways, and Dre references P-Funk. He acknowledges and gives tribute to George Clinton within this video as well. But I would say something is very different about the use here. And to me, this is what's indicative of a thoughtful analysis, of a thoughtful use of speculation. What Dr. Dre is doing is not speculation. Because again, he's using this idea not to talk about mothership and freedom in that sort of way. He's talking about lowriders. He's talking about the culture of, South Central LA in 92, 93, 94. But there's not those same speculative themes going on. It's very much of that time. So this is the thing that I really want you to think about with your sound examples, with your visual rhetoric examples, those sorts of things. Are they really doing speculative and futurist work? Or are they just addressing the theme? it's important to address the theme. I think that's great. It's useful. But we're trying to push towards that speculative futurist bent in particular.